Well, if you haven't gotten tired of my voice yet, maybe you will. All right. So, I find this part here very important. I'm not going to talk about the constructivist theory. You don't really need to get into that. What you do need to think about is how these sort of terms that we have used, such as us and them, this is very important because in sociology and in other social sciences, people often say there's an us versus them perspective or mentality, right? You're either one of us or you're with them. Insiders, outsiders, in place or out of place. But he says these are not innate categories like race and ethnicity, but are formed through unequal power relations, which is a very Marxist thing to say. In other words, it's created by social inequality, that is, the haves and the have nots. So, what becomes ours is much different than what becomes theirs. What I think he is trying to suggest here is that it's also not just a black and white picture. It's not just us versus them, ours versus theirs. There's a lot of gray area in between. Therefore, we need to think about these sort of differences and gray areas in between and why that's important. So, to go back to the essay one prompts, remember what I said. To what extent do we live in a very bordered world? It's not just pure, we are an extremely very bordered world. It's not just, well, we're not in a bordered world at all. There's always going to be an area in between. So think about not just what's obvious in front of you, but things that are not typical, things that you wouldn't even think about, right? Okay. So I really like this, and this is on page 7. Let me see if this is correct. Yeah, page 7. I really like this where he says, in some cases, control may be benign or beneficial by offering sanctuary and security. So, for example, borders, and this goes back to what he said in the beginning, right? He said that in one way, a factory uh, gate is supposed to prevent people from coming in, whereas a store during, let's say, Best Buy, for example, on Black Friday, is supposed to lure people to come in. And you're stopping them from coming in, so that way when they do come in, you just smash right through the door, right? So control, maybe for good purposes, right? We say we want these people to come in because this is a sanctuary city. This is a sanctuary space. People are welcome here. But in other cases, we can use it in the opposite direction. This place is a place of security. You are not allowed in here at any time, right? So not only does it have to be helpful, but it can also be oppressive and violent, right? Like a prison, which we saw most recently with how people saw what was going on at the US Mexico border, especially the separation of families, right? So that's very important because, again, borders can change, but they can also be used for different purposes, both good and bad, for help and for no one's benefit but others. The Iron Curtain, by the way, is a reference to the USSR, which is now considered Russia. And part of the problem, uh, and he mentions this later on, is that back then, uh, in the before the 80s, 60s to the 80s, almost all of Eastern Europe was just lumped into USSR. In other words, Ukraine and all these individual countries that we have today were once just uh, lumped and clumped into the USSR. In other words, there was an sort of this is the Eastern world, this is the Western world. We are communist in the East, you are capitalist in the West. And he says today, perhaps more than ever, the rise of cross border processes, patterns, and problems, often lumped together under the term globalization, challenges that, right? So, for example, in today's world, we know there are so many more countries than there ever were before. I think since I've been born, there have been a number. of states and countries that exist now that didn't exist when I was even born, right? Probably the same for you. So it's very interesting to see how people change things over time. So nowadays, the sort of cross bordering has changed the perspective of things. And cross bordering is something very important later on in several of the other articles. So, for example, a country may be trying to go green, whereas the other one next to it is not. And this is some of the very important things that you should become familiar with. The European Union is where people decided there should be no borders between certain European nations. If you all work together, we can make something amazing happen. And then, of course, NAFTA is very important. Some people said that we should get rid of it, but that's not necessarily the case. I'm not going to go too much into that. Okay. But that crossing borders in pursuit of opportunity, a range of non-state combatants like terrorists, pirates, and mercenaries cross borders to engage in illicit and destructive activities. So let's go back up here. This includes both wealthy cosmopolites, and I hate to say this, but in Los Angeles, by most standards around the world, we are considered these wealthy cosmopolites, regardless of where it is you go in the world. So they often associate us with wealth and with this sort of urban society, right? So in this case, what he's trying to say is that in crossing borders, there are many different people under many different circumstances that are trying to do things that could be helpful and destructive all at the same time. And it's very interesting that in today's world, there is more border security than there ever has been in the past. Although we have had major ones, and I'm surprised he doesn't mention the Great Wall of China, which is probably one of the biggest, he does say that there are quite a bit of additional borders that didn't exist previous to 2011. This is even more so now in the sort of modern world. By the way, does anyone know what this picture is? I'll give you 3 to 4 seconds to think about it. Okay, so here we go. If you remember in World War Z, uh, Brad Pitt gets into a plane, right? And as he's leaving, he sees all these zombies going over the border in Jerusalem, and he's like, "Whew, thank God!" And then he gets knocked out of the sky because there's a whole bunch of zombies. So that's a great, great photo. All right, I'm not going to get into too much of this. These are just philosophers, Western white philosophers, European philosophers over time who have described things about laws and borders. What is important is this tension, and he uses the word tension, the sort of issue with openness and closedness. So these are the sort of opposites of each other. And you want to write this down. Opposites always equals an opportunity for writing. Openness and closedness are opposites. This leads an opportunity for writing because you could talk about one sentence about the openness, another sentence about the closedness. So now you have yourself two sentences that you could requote and then focus on, right? And then the third sentence would be how they connect and relate to one another. Okay, we're not going to get into too much of that. By the way, the word oscillation means the differences. The differences between the ideals of security and opportunity. This is very important because, as I mentioned earlier, in the U.S.-Mexico border, there's an opportunity that people can seize so long as they use logic and reasoning and give supporting points of view for why it's important. So they can turn something that's an opportunity into and re-emphasize it as a emphasis on security. So I've already mentioned that with the border, right? At first it's just to keep away invaders and let's say even animals. But now we can make it a point of emphasis on security against other people trying to come into the land that might be immigrants, etc., etc. Therefore, we need to spend more money on it. So they start to use um, ideology as a way of gaining economic influence. Okay, this is very important. Although borders were often conceptualized as simple barriers and dividers of space, these were never, and are certainly not today, the only roles that borders play. So, now we're going to talk about the differences between how borders operate in our daily lives and the world around us. So that's going to be the next video. Hope you're having fun.